As Lucia is here, I want to say thank you so much to Lucia Della Porta. She is a complete genius. And I represent, in my capacity standing up here, the Boswell Book Festival, which Lucia came to. We were so thrilled she came this spring to Scotland to see our wonderful book festival. And it has been a great meeting of minds and culture. And Lucia saw Adam Zamoyski speaking and said, I want him for my festival. And so Adam is speaking as part of the great Pisa Boswell Festival unification, which is thrilling. And it is very, very thrilling to have Adam Zamoyski here, who is one of Europe's, and this is, I do exaggerate quite a lot, but this is not an exaggeration. He is one of Europe's most authoritative and engaging historians and biographers, who has written wonderful books on Chopin, a great history of Poland, and a wonderful account of the Congress of Vienna, as well as many other books. One of his total masterpieces is his latest book, Napoleon, in which he brings all his intellect and feel and greatness and imagination as a writer to bear on this wonderful subject. So a big round of applause for Adam Zamoyski.
Thank you. I don't know where you all come from and what your background is, because obviously this is rather a curious event. But wherever you've come from, and whatever family you came from, whichever country you came from, you will have been given an impression, a picture of Napoleon, either as a genius, a demigod, a hero, a wonderful man, a creator of modern Europe, or as a monster, a dictator, a warmonger, responsible for hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of deaths. Or whichever image you've been given, it will have been wrong, totally wrong, because Napoleon is one of those subjects that have been used by everybody and every cause in order to create arguments for itself. And as a result, people have forgotten one thing, which is that he was just a man. He was just a human being like every single person in this room. Yes, he was very clever. He had a very good brain. He had extraordinary powers of concentration. He had an astonishing memory. He had charm when he wanted to. But he was essentially, in many ways, quite an ordinary human being. And this is what makes his life so extraordinary, because this little boy from Ajaccio rose to become, his trajectory was probably the greatest trajectory of any man in history. I don't know how many of you here have ever been to Corsica or to Ajaccio, but if you have, you will have realized that Corsica is a very small place, although there's plenty of space. Very little of that space is of any use, either for cultivation or for grazing or even for building on. And as a result, the whole of Corsica, and if you look at Ajaccio itself, you see it even today, the old part, is incredibly tight. And the society Napoleon was born into was a society in which everybody was elbowing for space, for survival. And it was extraordinary. They married for half a hectare of vineyard. That was a really good dowry. Everything was traded. There was very little money on Corsica when he was born, hardly any money, and everything was bartered and traded. a couple of jars of olive oil for a couple of barrels of wine for half a sheep or a goat. If you look at the inventories which exist, you know, in the Bonaparte household, there was 9 pewter plates at one stage. They're listed, 9 pewter plates, not silver, pewter. So it was a society in which if you stood still, you were trampled. And Napoleon's father, Carlo Maria Bonaparte, had no intention of standing still. He was an arch snob. He is the culprit. If you hate Napoleon and what he did to Europe, blame it on Carlo Maria Bonaparte, not on Napoleon. Because he was determined that his children should rise in the world and that he should get out of this little tight place in Ajaccio, where the Bonapartes were sort of on the fringe between the nobilità and the anziani, but not quite there. And they occasionally married quite well, but you know, they weren't quite smart enough. The young Napoleon was, at the age of 9, he left this society and was sent to Brienne in northeastern France. Cold, a different climate, a school, strict discipline. He could barely speak French. He had to learn French in the space of a couple of months. He spoke atrociously bad French to the rest of his life. He had an appalling accent, so when he arrived at school, he was a colonial, he was small, he was sickly, he was an unimpressive figure. There were also rumors that he was not the father of the son of his father, but of the French governor of Corsica, and so he was not in a very good position. He did what any intelligent boy does in this situation. He decided to work hard, and he read, he studied, because for the first time in his life he had a library at his disposal, and so he read, he studied like mad, and because he was very clever, he did well. But as he progressed to the École Militaire, he was still this colonial, this person who was not quite socially acceptable, although Carlo Maria had managed to get acceptance of the soi-disant noble status of the Bonapartes. And when he became a serving officer, he did make friends. He wasn't completely alienated. He wasn't pushed around. But he was not one of the gang he was not easy with other people. He felt apart. And what's very interesting is that he was a product of the Enlightenment and of the Enlightenment literature which he'd read. And as you all know, one of the great cults of the Enlightenment philosophy was started by people like Voltaire, was that it was Western society and Christian society that had corrupted man, and man left in his ideal state was clean and pure, and the myth of the noble savage. And Boswell had written up Corsica, the Republic of Corsica under Pasquale Paoli, as the ideal society of noble savages, as it were. And so when he was, as a young man, as this young officer, Napoleon he developed this cult of himself as a Corsican patriot of this wonderful island that had been destroyed and raped by the French. And this gave him a kind of moral standing against his French brother officers. Okay, they looked down on him because he wasn't as noble as they were and whatever, but he looked down on them saying, yeah, but I come from a great people, a pure people, and you're just a load of colonial shits. And this gave him tremendous moral validation and an argument it sort of mobilized him. And anyway, the French Revolution comes along, and the first thing he thinks of is this is an opportunity for Corsica to regain its independence once again. So he goes off to Corsica and starts trying to play a political role with his brother, his elder brother, Joseph. And in small-town Corsican politics, the two of them very quickly learned that the only way you could get anything done was by cheating. And in the space of a couple of months, they had falsified their birth certificates so as to make themselves eligible for office. They had falsified votes. They had used pressure and force to affect elections. They'd bribed people. They'd basically run the whole gamut of political corruption. And they had learnt one thing, because at the end of a couple of years of this politicking, the entire Bonaparte clan was thrown out of Corsica. And Napoleon learnt one lesson from that. Don't lose. You have to win. And it doesn't matter what methods you use, but you have to win. You cannot afford to lose. So that was a formation in this man who was still very, very insecure. And they arrived in Toulon in 1793, France in a state of revolution, Robespierre in power, and they are technically, he's an aristocrat. So he has to be very, very careful. But he's an officer in the army, and so he carries on being that. And he has a lucky break because the Allies invade and seize Toulon, and the Republican army, which wants to throw them out, hasn't got anybody to command the artillery. He comes along, he's nominated, and though he's only a captain, he's quickly made a major. He's extremely efficient. He sets his mind to it. He finds all the cannon from anywhere he can. He mobilizes people. He sees where to place it. There's no genius about it, but he's just very, very efficient, hardworking, and does it, and brave, and it works. The later Napoleonic myth dresses this up as the moment when he, the genius, breaks through. Well, there's nothing genius about it, because you only have to look at a map to see where to place the cannons, and the authorities in Paris even could see that. But he did it. And he gets promoted to the rank of general at 24. But this again isn't proof of something extraordinary, because in the previous 2 years, the French Republic had promoted no fewer than 962 generals, some of them younger than Napoleon. So, it was a promotion, but not that great. And here you've got this young man who is a career officer, but he's not really going anywhere. He doesn't suddenly get given a huge command. He's given the command of the artillery of the army of Italy, which is strung out along the coast, along Nice and so on. And he doesn't really know what to do with his career. And after a bit, he's sent to Paris. And there he meets he really finds himself in a very difficult position, because on Corsica, they'd always been very poor. And it was a very provincial society. And he had had very little experience. He had certainly never had much social experience, and absolutely no sexual experience. And yet he arrived in Paris in 1794, which was just after the fall of Robespierre, and suddenly there was an explosion of exuberance and suddenly people started making money like mad and spending money. And because a lot of property had been confiscated from aristos, people were buying and selling chateaux, furniture, townhouses. And because the paper money issued by the government kept dropping in value, people were doing extraordinary operations of buying and selling property in order to. And suddenly this young man sees money being made, and he forgets about his military career almost, which is actually quite stagnant, and he starts speculating on property, on importing silks from Genoa for the luxury trade in Paris, coffee from Genoa, his brother's in Genoa. He starts importing contraband and speculating on property. And talking about his letters, it's fascinating. He keeps talking about money and how much one could make if one bought this chateau and did it up, and then you could sell it. And he keeps writing to his brother saying, come on, get your friends to send me more money so I can do this. And the other terrible shock for him in Paris is that at the fall of the terror, there's an explosion of sexual activity as well, of freedom, of release. And all social barriers had been broken down, and there were these extraordinary parties where anybody could go to, and where the girls wore dresses which hardly hid anything. And he was very, very middle class, very petit bourgeois in his attitudes. He was a prig. And at the École Militaire, he broke up with a great friend of his because one of his friends decided to come out of the closet and go gay. And he says, I can't be a friend with somebody who is disgusting like you. He was always, to the end of his life, he hated anything that was, a bit... And suddenly, he's in Paris, and he sees all this activity, and it excites him, but it frightens him at the same time. And so he's very, very confused. And he doesn't know where to go. And then suddenly there's this great break in his life, this breakthrough, when there's a royalist plot against the Directoire, and the head of the Directoire, Barras, needs a general to command the troops to defend the government, and Napoleon comes to hand. And we don't quite know what happened because all the accounts were tampered with later. But he must have been effective because he's then given command of the Army of the Interior, which made him extremely powerful. So powerful, in fact, that he then starts telling the Directory, the government, what to do. Because the other thing about Napoleon was he was very, very clever, and he was what would now be called a control freak. He was always looking out over other people's shoulders, and he could see how things could be done better, more efficiently. And so he kept turning up at the government and saying, no, not like this, you should do this, which obviously infuriated them and worried them because they thought, hang on, this guy's going to take over sooner or later. So they do two things. They marry him off. Barras gets rid of an old mistress, an unwanted mistress, and marries him off. Very good combination. And they give him command of the Army of Italy, which is not supposed to play a significant role at all. Well, first of all, they marry Napoleon off to Josephine, who's older and who's a very experienced and, by all accounts, very, very sexy woman. And for the first time in his life, this young man has his first real sexual experience. And he goes wild. He cannot believe it. He keeps wanting to get back into bed with her. He writes her letters saying, when can I come back? She's not particularly interested. And he goes off to Italy to take command of an army which has no boots, no uniforms, hardly any arms. They have no horses. The officers are riding mules. The men's hats, some of them, they just have handkerchiefs tied in knots on their backs, on their heads. They are a mess. And he realizes that if he fails, he's in trouble, because generals who failed were then sent back to Paris and guillotined, or at the very best, just put away. And so he galvanizes the army brilliantly. He tells them, he lectures them. He says, "You're heroes, you're brilliant, you're magnificent." Every time they win a small engagement, he tells them they're heroes. He exploits the situation very cleverly. He studies the terrain. He's got an incredible memory. He's got a quick mind. He's very reactive and quickly reactive. And he wins a whole lot of very small victories, good victories, but very small ones, quite insignificant ones, against the Austrians and the Sardinians. And after each of the victories, he tells the troops that they're brilliant. He also tells them that once they've got over the Alps in northern Italy, they can rape and loot and do anything they want, and they'll fill their bellies, and which they do. And at the same time, in order to cover his back, he sends back to Paris entirely fictitious reports and descriptions of the battles. He inflates a skirmish where 3,000 troops on one side fight 5,000 on the other, and they're, at the end of the day, there are 300 dead and 500 wounded. He reports back that there was a tremendous battle which for hours was heroically fought on both sides, and then they killed, I don't know how many thousands of Austrians and took thousands of prisoners and so on. And every government loves a good story, unpopular governments particularly, and the French Directory was very unpopular with its people. And so they read these bulletins with delight and posted them up on street corners, not realizing they were actually creating a figure. They were beginning to create this extraordinary person. Everybody in France soon was talking about this wonderful Général Bonaparte who was winning these wonderful victories. It was some time before the Directory realized their mistake, and he went on. And it was a very curious moment in history. And it's very important to realize that every epoch has its zeitgeist. And the end of the 18th century, Napoleon's generation was brought up on the literature of the Enlightenment partly, but already on the beginnings of Romanticism. And the French officer schools didn't teach tactics or military operations. They taught the idea of leadership and the idea of excellence and the idea of emulation. And the Bible of the French military schools was Plutarch's Lives of the Great Figures of Antiquity. So all these young officers went out into the world wanting to be Alexander the Great, as did Napoleon. And they were tripping in a way. Marmont, one of Napoleon's future marshal, and one of Napoleon's aides de camp, writes, he had himself, before the campaign of Italy, he had himself a signet ring made. On it, there were 3 interleaved crowns, one of ivy, signifying eternity, one of laurel, signifying fame, one of myrtle, signifying manhood, and the legend, I hope to deserve them. Madame de Staël, in a book published that very year, 1797, of Napoleon's first Italian campaign, she writes, "Of all the passions which affect the human heart, there is none that is more forceful than the love of la gloire. It is without doubt an intoxicating sensation to fill the universe with one's name, to go so far beyond the bounds of one's being that it becomes possible to delude oneself as to the limits and the extent of one's life, and to believe that one possesses some of the metaphysical attributes of infinity. Napoleon's propaganda, for political reasons, was in tune with these aspirations and with these feelings. And undoubtedly, all these young men who began to achieve things, they would attack an army larger than theirs, and they'd win. And they began to feel, hang on, we are special. And Napoleon kept telling them they're special. They began to believe it. And because they believed it, they were even more courageous, and the dash was such that the regular Austrian troops just didn't know how to respond. And so success piled on success. And very quickly a sort of idea spread that, that there was something rather exceptional about this man. And, you know, between him taking command of the army of Italy at the beginning of 1796 and the end of 1797, there were no less than 72 pamphlets published around Europe about General Bonaparte. And by the end of 1798, there were no less than 37 different prints representing him winning victories or liberating Italy or doing something magnificent. And people began to think of him as really exceptional. And inevitably, as always happens, people get taken in by their own propaganda. And he began to believe this. And after the extraordinary event of the Bridge of Lodi, where he had wanted to cut off the Austrians who were retreating, but he didn't. And he raced up with not many troops, and he saw the last ones crossing. And instead of waiting, as a normal general would have done, for the rest of his army to catch up, he didn't wait, he quickly put some guns up and swept his people forward. And after a bit, they managed to take the bridge. Well, as he himself said that evening, però non fu una grande cosa. But, because it wasn't, I think the French lost 150-something casualties and the Austrians about twice as much. But a couple of days later, he suddenly decided, and he announced to Marmont that fate had singled him out, and that fate was now his mistress, and that he was destined for great things. And this faith helped him to achieve extraordinary things. But he achieved them, let us remember, by extraordinary hard work and application. He studied all the time. He kept looking at maps. He said, right, he would see where the enemy could advance and where it could retreat and where it couldn't retreat. And he was very good at calculating how he could respond to any move. He then went on to more and more moments which built up this faith, because suddenly he finds himself, having liberated the whole of Italy from the Austrians, he finds himself in Milan, essentially governing the whole of northern Italy and giving constitutions and telling people what to do, and suddenly realizes, hang on, this is rather fun. I quite like running the place. I quite like being the boss. And then he sees that, well, why isn't he running France? He could do it better than the Directory. And so he goes back to Paris, and lots of people want him to take over, but he realizes that it's too early, it's too dangerous. And what's more, that he can't stay in France because he will be, it's one of those awful revolutionary situations where you can't step back and you can't stand still. You either go up or you go down. Like in Stalinist Russia, you just There's no way you can stand still. And so, luckily for him, the Egyptian expedition comes up. And he goes off, and again, Nelson blows up his fleet, and he's cut off, and suddenly he's a pharaoh running Egypt, introducing street lighting, sewage, a land registry, new institutions. He has a wonderful time. And then the Syrian campaign, where he has to make terribly hard choices, where he, for instance, he takes prisoners whom he can't feed, and he takes the awful choice of having them massacred. And his men don't like it. But he tells Berthier, his chief of staff, who says, you can't do this, he says, well, okay, you go to a monastery, if that's the way you feel. But what do you suggest? And of course, they all admire him. And his great enemy amongst his subalterns in Syria, Kléber, says, I can't stand this man, but he dares, and he dares to dare. And this is extraordinary. They suddenly realize he's got leadership material. He will do things they don't dare to do. And he realizes that he's managed to keep this mess of an army together in terrible conditions in Syria, without supplies, and they follow him. And a sergeant writes, the army had to believe, like him, in fate, for it seemed as though he had it written on his forehead that cannonballs and grape shot must respect his person. He then comes back to France, and he's greeted by people saying, here is our liberator, the heavens have sent him. And, well, you know the rest. He begins to run France. But the awful thing is that, you see, by this stage, this man can no longer stop. He has to go on. He has to carry on. He gains power in the coup d'etat, and there's 3 consuls, but he realizes he has to have absolute power because he won't be able to do anything if he has to share the power and discuss things. So he has to have absolute power, and so it goes on, and it's a bit like the fairy tale of the sorcerer's apprentice. It just gets more and more strong. And the awful thing is that the human being inside him gets crushed, and there are moments still usually when he's with children or with simple soldiers or at home, where he's normal. There's a wonderful scene which the painter, the portrait, the miniaturist, Isabey, describes how at Malmaison, one afternoon, they're all wandering around the garden. And at one stage, Napoleon bends down to look at a flower, and Isabey runs over and leapfrogs him. And Napoleon thinks it's wonderful. Well, you don't really think of Napoleon as having that kind of a sense of humor. Indeed, he was at his happiest almost on St. Helena when he'd been toppled, where he had huge fun with the 14-year-old daughter of the British East India agent. And she writes, he seemed to enter into every sort of mirth or fun with the glee of child, though I have often tried his patience severely, I never knew him to lose his temper or fall back upon his rank or age. He played hide and seek with them. He played silly games. He made faces for these little girls. There was always a human being, but the terrible thing was, and again, here is the problem. It's all down to Carlo Maria and Ajaccio, I'm afraid, because he explained to one of his collaborators when he was first consul, he said to Thibaudot, a first consul is not like one of those kings by the grace of God who view their states as an inheritance. He needs brilliant actions and therefore war. And in 1813, when Metternich was desperately trying to preserve him on the throne because he wanted a strong France, he didn't want Russia too strong, And Metternich pleaded with him quietly, saying, look, sign a peace now on whatever terms, and then we'll save your throne. You stand. And he says, your sovereigns born on the throne can afford to let themselves be beaten 20 times and still return to their capitals. I cannot, because I'm a parvenu. I'm a soldier. My authority will not survive the day when I will cease to be strong and therefore to be feared. His terrible social insecurity. Carlo Maria's snobism and insecurity came in. And this poor man, in a sense, you have to realize that it's actually quite a sad story of a perfectly nice man, not an exceptionally nice man, but a perfectly nice man, capable like the rest of us to be of good and bad, is caught up really in a maelstrom of events from which he cannot extricate himself. And it is really like one of the great Greek tragedies of, he goes up and he's just going to go down. From 1807, at the moment of the signature of the Treaty of Tilsit, you realize that he's then caught in a situation from which he will not be able to extricate himself. I've been going on for too long. One can go on forever about Napoleon, but essentially, this is the thing to remember about him, and to look beyond all those heroic pictures. And by the way, if you look at the portraits painted of him from life, and you look carefully, you can see the insecurity. He's looking out saying, does anybody really believe in this? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.